She never rolled up her sleeves. Not once. In the sweltering heat of a failing air conditioner during a Chicago summer, or in the sterile, blood-warmed confines of Trauma Bay 3, Nurse Ilara Vance's arms remained shrouded in the crisp, white fabric of her uniform. The policy was short sleeves for hygiene, for ease of movement, for the simple practicality of a job that was equal parts science and messy corporeal labor. Everyone else complied. Ilara, however, existed as a quiet exception, a ghost in the machine of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital. Her supervisors had tried to address it early on, but her performance was so flawless, her efficiency so preternatural, that the minor infraction was allowed to slide into the realm of unspoken eccentricity. They thought she was just a nurse, a profoundly competent but socially withdrawn woman hiding some past sadness. They were dead wrong. Her world was a symphony of controlled chaos, and she was its silent conductor. The staccato beep of a heart monitor, the urgent hiss of an oxygen mask, the wet slap of gauze on a wound, these were the notes of her daily existence. She moved through the emergency department not like a person walking, but like water flowing, finding the path of least resistance around gurneys, panicked family members and frantic residents. Her hands, when they emerged from those long cuffs, were a surgeon's envy, steady, precise, and deft. She could cannulate a collapsed vein on a dehydrated patient in near darkness, her fingers finding their mark with an instinct that bordered on supernatural. Her face was a placid mask, her voice a low monotone that could cut through the shrillest hysterics, calming patients and colleagues alike with its sheer, unwavering certainty. The staff gossiped, of course, in the brief lulls between catastrophes, huddled over lukewarm coffee in the break room, they spun theories. The prevailing one, colored with a sad, pitying sort of respect, was that the scars beneath her sleeves were self-inflicted, the tragic map of a battle with demons they could only imagine. Others whispered of a horrific car accident or a house fire from which she had barely escaped. Ilara offered no clues. Questions about her past were met with a polite, impenetrable wall of silence. She would give a small, tight nod, her grey eyes clouding over for a fraction of a second, and then she would pivot to a question about a patient's lactate levels or the need for a new IV bag. The subject, like her forearms, remained covered. There were hints, however, for those observant enough to see them. Small, discordant notes in her otherwise seamless performance of an ordinary nurse. During a mass casualty incident involving a factory explosion, a young police officer, fresh from the academy and pale with shock, had dropped his sidearm, the clatter lost in the din. Ilara, without breaking stride or looking down, had stooped, scooped up the weapon in one fluid motion, cleared the chamber, and handed it back to him butt first, her thumb securely on the decocking lever. "Keep your weapon retained," she had murmured, her voice flat and devoid of judgment, before continuing on to triage the next patient. The officer had stared after her, his mouth agape, recognizing a familiarity with the firearm that no nursing school could have taught. Another time, a patient, delirious from a head injury, had become violent, swinging a heavy metal bedpan. Security was moments away, but the man was a danger to himself and a fragile, elderly patient in the next bed. While others backed away, Ilara had moved in. She did not fight him. She flowed around his wild swing, her body moving with a liquid grace that was shockingly fast. One hand cupped his elbow, the other pressed a single, precise finger into a nerve cluster below his jaw. The man's arm went limp, his eyes rolled back, and he slumped unconscious onto the gurney. The entire event took less than 3 seconds. When the burly security guards arrived, they found her calmly checking the man's pulse, her expression as serene as ever. She had simply said, "Patient secured. Vital signs are stable." She never explained the technique, a perfect application of pressure point control that was the hallmark of elite special forces training. The incident was logged as patient subdued without injury, and the whispers about her grew a little quieter, a little more filled with a confused, almost fearful respect. Her cover, as she thought of it, was more than just the sleeves. It was the quietness, the way she made herself small and unobtrusive. It was a conscious act of camouflage, a desperate attempt to shed a skin that no longer fit, to bury a woman who had been forged in fire and violence. The scars were a part of that past, a permanent record of failure and survival. They were a complex tapestry of silvery tissue, some thin and pale like surgical incisions, others puckered and wide from shrapnel. One a jagged, starburst pattern on her left forearm, where a piece of heated metal had melted into her flesh. They were a testament to a single catastrophic night in a forgotten corner of the world, a night that had cost her everything. Hiding them was not about shame. It was about protecting the fragile peace she had tried to build in the sterile, orderly world of medicine. It was about keeping the wolf leashed and hidden beneath the sheep's clothing of a healer. The catalyst for the unraveling of this carefully constructed piece arrived not with the scream of sirens, but with the quiet, expensive click of Italian leather shoes on polished linoleum. Marcus Thorne was the hospital administrator, a man who saw patients not as people to be healed, but as assets or liabilities on a balance sheet. He was tall and thin, with a face that seemed perpetually pinched in disapproval and a voice that could peel paint. He moved through the hospital like a predator, sniffing out inefficiency and anything that might tarnish the pristine, profitable image of St. Jude's. He despised the messiness of the emergency department and held a particular disdain for its staff, whom he viewed as little more than glorified janitors. On that particular Tuesday, Thorne was in his element, radiating a smug, proprietary aura. Senator Alistair Thompson, a powerful political figure and a major donor to the hospital, had been admitted for a minor elective cardiac procedure. The entire VIP wing had been cleared, and Thorne was personally overseeing every detail, his presence a constant, grating irritant to the medical staff. The senator was accompanied by a Secret Service detail, sharp-eyed men in dark suits who spoke in low murmurs into their wrists. One of them, a young, fit agent named Miller, had sustained a nasty-looking gash on his forearm during a recent training drill, and it had become inflamed. He was quietly directed to the ER for treatment, while the senator was prepped for his procedure upstairs. Ilara was assigned to him. She entered the private examination room to find Agent Miller sitting stoically on the edge of the bed, his jacket off, his own sleeve rolled up to reveal a red, angry-looking wound. He was watching her with the cautious, analytical gaze of a professional assessing a potential threat. Ilara simply nodded, her eyes already focused on the injury. "I'm Nurse Vance," she said, her voice soft. "Let's take a look at that." She worked with her usual silent efficiency, cleaning the wound, checking for signs of deeper infection, her touch gentle but firm. Miller, a man trained to endure pain without flinching, found himself impressed by her calm, her absolute focus. He noticed her long sleeves, a strange detail in the warm room, but filed it away as a personal quirk. It was then that Marcus Thorne swept into the room, a sycophantic smile plastered on his face. "Agent Miller, I do hope everything is to your satisfaction. We pride ourselves on providing the absolute best care for our distinguished guests." His eyes fell on Ilara, and the smile curdled into a sneer. He saw not a competent professional, but a lowly nurse who was failing to adequately project the hospital's brand of cheerful five-star service. She had not greeted him. She had not fawned over the agent. She was simply doing her job. "Nurse," Thorne's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet. "Is there a problem? You seem incapable of even offering a simple welcome to our guest. A smile wouldn't kill you. Or perhaps your disposition is as unpleasant as your appearance." His gaze flicked pointedly to her long sleeves. "Frankly, your whole presentation is a disgrace. You look like some piece of damaged goods hiding from the world. We have standards at St. Jude's, standards you clearly do not meet." The attack was so sudden, so vicious and personal, that the air in the room seemed to crystallize. Agent Miller stiffened, his protective instincts flaring. He had seen bullies on playgrounds and in boardrooms, and he recognized Thorne for exactly what he was. He opened his mouth to intervene, to defend the quiet nurse who was expertly bandaging his arm. But Ilara gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head, her eyes never leaving her work. She tied off the bandage with a perfect knot, her hands as steady as stone. She did not look at Thorne. She did not acknowledge his tirade. She simply finished her task, her silence a more profound rebuke than any words could have been. To Thorne, this was the ultimate insult. His authority had been ignored. He, the master of this domain, had been dismissed by a mere nurse. His face flushed a dark, mottled red. "That's it," he hissed, his voice trembling with fury. "You're finished. Pack your things. You are on administrative leave, effective immediately. Consider your career at this hospital, and likely any other, over. I will personally see to it." Ilara finally looked up, her grey eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them, no anger. There was only a deep, profound weariness, the look of a soldier who had survived a war only to be felled by a petty bureaucrat. She gave a single, slow nod. "Understood," she said, her voice still a quiet monotone. She stripped off her gloves, disposed of them in the biohazard bin, and walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving Thorne fuming and Agent Miller staring after her with a dawning sense of unease. He had seen that look before in the eyes of seasoned operators in war zones. The calm before a storm. The professional fallout was as swift and brutal as Thorne had promised. A memo was circulated. An emergency disciplinary hearing was scheduled for the following morning, a mere formality. Ilara knew she would be its only attendee. The system, with its deep-seated reverence for money and power, had already rendered its verdict. She was in the staff locker room, a small, windowless space that smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion, methodically clearing out her locker. She folded her spare uniform with military precision, placing it in a simple canvas bag. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a film of someone else's life. The quiet world she had so carefully constructed was dissolving, and she was not sure what, if anything, would be left in its place. It was then that the world ended. It began not with a bang, but with a series of soft, muffled pops from the direction of the VIP wing. It sounded like a car backfiring, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Then the lights flickered and died, plunging the locker room into darkness, replaced a second later by the eerie, blood-red glow of the emergency lighting. A woman screamed somewhere down the hall. A new sound followed, the sharp, terrifyingly distinct crack of unsuppressed gunfire. The hospital's PA system crackled to life, a panicked voice shouting, "Code Silver! Code Silver! Active shooter on the 4th floor! Initiate lockdown procedures." Ilara froze, her hand hovering over the last item in her locker, a worn paperback novel. The sounds were wrong. This wasn't a lone, deranged individual. The initial shots had been suppressed, precise. The unsuppressed fire was heavier, more controlled. It was a coordinated attack. Her mind, a machine honed by years of threat assessment, began to process the data with cold, terrifying speed. The target was Senator Thompson. The attackers were professionals. The lockdown wouldn't hold them for more than a few minutes. The hospital's security team, mostly retired cops with paunches and sidearms, would be a speed bump at best. She was trapped. Her life as a nurse was over, and now, it seemed, her life itself was on the line. She could hide, wait it out, hope for the best. It was the sensible thing to do. It was what a nurse would do. But as another volley of gunfire echoed from above, followed by the shattering of glass, something inside her broke. It was a dam she had built stone by painful stone over years of quiet reflection and forced peace. And now, with the familiar sounds of combat echoing in her ears, the dam crumbled, and the river of her past came rushing back in a torrent. The weariness in her eyes evaporated, replaced by a chillingly clear, glacial focus. The nurse, the ghost of St. Jude's, vanished. In her place stood Valkyrie. Her posture changed. The slight, protective slump of her shoulders straightened, her spine aligning into a rigid column. Her head came up, her senses expanding, tasting the air, mapping the sounds, building a three-dimensional image of the battlefield in her mind. Her movements, once merely efficient, became lethally economical. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears from a nearby cart, the heavy steel cool and solid in her hand. She moved to the locker room door, pressing her ear against it, listening not as a frightened civilian, but as a hunter. The chaos in the hallway was a symphony of terror, screams, running feet, the distant rhythmic crackle of assault rifles. She slipped out into the corridor. It was a scene from a nightmare. The red emergency lights cast long, dancing shadows. Staff and patients were either fleeing or huddled behind whatever cover they could find. Ilara ignored them. Her focus was singular. She moved against the flow of the panicked crowd, a salmon swimming upstream, her eyes scanning for threats, for opportunities. She saw Agent Miller, his arm bleeding afresh, trying to shepherd a group of nurses toward a stairwell while drawing his own weapon. He was good, but he was alone and injured. Then they appeared at the far end of the hall. 4 of them moving in a tight diamond formation. They were clad in black tactical gear, armed with short-barreled rifles fitted with suppressors and optics. They moved with the fluid, predatory grace of apex predators. These were not common thugs. This was a wet team, Tier 1 operators or the mercenary equivalent. Their leader, a tall man with cold, dead eyes, gestured with his hand, and the team split, 2 peeling off to secure a side corridor, 2 advancing directly toward her and Miller's position. This was a kill box. The mask did not just drop, it shattered. Ilara saw Agent Miller raise his pistol to engage, a brave but suicidal move. She saw the lead operator, the one with the dead eyes who she would later know as Kalen, raise his rifle, the laser sight a tiny red hornet dancing on Miller's chest. There was no time for a warning. There was no time for anything but action. She grabbed a rolling IV pole heavy with bags of saline. With a grunt of effort that seemed impossible for her slender frame, she shoved it with all her might. The pole careened down the hallway, metal clattering loudly on the tile. It was a perfect distraction. Kalen and his partner flinched, their aim diverted for a split second. It was all the time Ilara needed. She exploded into motion, covering the 20 feet to the nearest attacker in a blur of white uniform. The man was turning back toward her, his eyes widening in surprise as this unassuming nurse closed the distance with inhuman speed. He never had a chance to bring his rifle to bear. Ilara's left hand shot out, grabbing the barrel of his weapon and wrenching it aside. Her right hand, holding the trauma shears, plunged the thick steel blades deep into the soft tissue beneath his jaw, severing his carotid artery and spinal cord in one brutal, devastating motion. He dropped like a stone, his finger spasming on the trigger, sending a burst of suppressed rounds harmlessly into the ceiling. She did not pause. She did not hesitate. As the first man fell, she used his body as a shield and a pivot point, ripping his rifle from his dead hands. The weapon felt like an extension of her own arm, its weight, its balance intimately familiar. She brought it to her shoulder, her cheek finding the stock in a perfect weld. The second operator was already firing, his rounds thudding into the corpse of his comrade. Ilara squeezed the trigger, not a panicked spray, but 2 precise shots. A controlled pair. The rounds struck the man in the center of his faceplate, the 300 blackout cartridges designed for close-quarters combat shattering the ballistic glass and the bone behind it. He crumpled to the ground. The entire engagement, from the IV pole to the second kill, had taken less than 5 seconds. Agent Miller stared, his own pistol lowered, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The quiet, reserved nurse had just dispatched 2 highly trained operators with a level of speed and ruthless efficiency he had only ever seen at the highest levels of the special operations community. In the VIP suite, Marcus Thorne, who had been peering through the reinforced glass of the door, stumbled back, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He wasn't seeing a nurse. He was seeing a monster, a whirlwind of violence wrapped in a white uniform. On the security monitors in the main nursing station, a group of huddled staff watched the silent video feed, their hands clasped over their mouths in silent, horrified awe. The power dynamic of the entire hospital had just been irrevocably inverted by the woman they thought they knew. Ilara ignored them all. She checked the rifle she had acquired, a SIG Rattler, top of the line. Full magazine. She tossed a spare mag to a stunned Agent Miller. "Cover the rear," she commanded, her voice no longer the soft murmur of a nurse, but the hard, clipped bark of a field commander. "They'll try to flank from the stairwell. Engage on sight." Miller, his training kicking in, simply nodded, his shock momentarily replaced by the grim focus of a soldier who had just found an unexpected and terrifyingly competent ally. The remaining 2 operators were smarter. They didn't charge. They used cover, communicating in clipped, professional whispers over their radios. Ilara could hear them, her senses preternaturally sharp. One was Kalen, the leader. He was directing his man to lay down suppressive fire while he moved to a better angle. Ilara didn't wait for him to get there. She grabbed a defibrillator from a crash cart, ripped the pads off, and cranked the charge to the maximum 360 joules. Peeking around the corner, she saw the second Merc laying down fire toward Miller's position. She waited for a lull in the firing, then moved. She was a ghost. She used the chaos and the flickering red light to her advantage, her soft-soled nursing shoes making no sound on the linoleum. The operator was so focused on Miller that he never saw her coming. She pressed the charged defibrillator paddles to the sides of his helmet. The jolt of electricity arced through the metal and electronics, shorting out his comms and optics, and, more importantly, sending a massive, incapacitating shock through his skull. He seized violently and collapsed, his rifle clattering to the floor. Only Kalen remained. He was good. Very good. He had realized his team was being systematically dismantled by an unknown entity and had fallen back, taking up a defensive position near the entrance to the senator's suite. He was using Thorne and the senator as human shields. "Whoever you are, this is over." Kalen's voice, electronically filtered through his comms, echoed down the hall. "I have the target. You want him to live, you back off now." Ilara knew it was a lie. His mission was assassination, not kidnapping. He was buying time, trying to draw her out. She scanned her environment, blood bags hanging from an IV tree, An oxygen tank, a floor polishing machine. An idea, cold and ruthless, formed in her mind. She took the scalpel from her pocket, the one she had used on the first operator, and silently sliced open 2 bags of saline, letting the clear liquid pool on the floor near Kalen's position. Then she retrieved the floor polisher. "You're trapped," she called out, her voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the violence she had just unleashed. "Your exit is compromised. Your team is down. Surrender now." A harsh, humorless laugh came from Kalen's position. "I don't think so." Ilara flicked the switch on the floor polisher. Its heavy-duty power cord snaked across the floor, right through the puddle of saline she had created. She kicked the machine, sending it spinning into the wall. The impact broke the housing, exposing live wires. The moment they hit the saline solution, the entire puddle electrified. Kalen screamed, a high, agonized sound as thousands of volts coursed through his tactical boots and into his body. He convulsed, his rifle firing a wild burst into the ceiling before he fell, twitching to the ground. Ilara advanced on him, the cig rattler held at the low, ready. He was still alive, groaning, his body spasming. As she stood over him, he looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of agony and disbelief. What are you?" he choked out. Ilara looked down at him, her face an emotionless mask. "I'm the nurse," she said, and fired a single, precise shot that ended the confrontation permanently. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hum of the damaged floor polisher and the distant wail of approaching sirens. The battle was over. Ilara stood in the center of the corridor, a spectre in white surrounded by the bodies of trained killers, her uniform spattered with blood. Her sleeves, torn during the final struggle, had been pushed up to her elbows, revealing the full, horrifying, and heroic tapestry of her scars to the world. Just as the first SWAT team began to breach the hospital entrance, a new sound drowned out the sirens. It was the percussive thumping of helicopter rotors, deafeningly close. 2 sleek, black MH-6 Little Birds, the preferred transport of Delta Force and other clandestine units, descended on the hospital's rooftop helipad, while a fleet of black Chevrolet Suburbans screeched to a halt at the main entrance, disgorging a dozen men in dark suits and earpieces who moved with the same lethal grace as the men Ilara had just killed. They swept past the bewildered local police, forming a cordon. The rear door of the lead Suburban opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a mane of silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, but he moved with the unmistakable bearing of a lifelong military commander. This was General Marcus Sterling, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, a living legend in the intelligence community. He strode into the hospital, his eyes sweeping over the carnage in the hallway with a look of grim, professional assessment. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed like he had expected it. His gaze bypassed the cowering form of Marcus Thorne, who had finally emerged from the senator's room. He ignored the senator himself. He walked past the bodies of the dead mercenaries without a second glance. His eyes found Ilara, standing alone amidst the wreckage. She hadn't moved. She was still holding the rifle, its barrel pointed safely at the floor. Sterling stopped a few feet from her. His hard eyes softened with something that looked like profound relief and a deep, abiding respect. He looked at the blood on her uniform, at the weapon in her hands, and finally at the scarred arms she no longer tried to hide. He did not say her name. He said a single word, a name that had been a ghost story whispered in the halls of Langley and Fort Bragg for years. "Valkyrie," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We've been looking for you." And then, in the middle of the blood-soaked corridor, in front of SWAT officers, shell-shocked hospital staff, and a United States senator, the director of the CIA, raised his hand and gave her a slow, formal military salute. Thorne, seeing his chance to regain control, to spin the narrative, scurried forward. "General Sterling, thank God you're here," he babbled, his voice high and shrill. "This nurse, she went completely insane. She killed all these men. She has to be arrested. She's a menace." Sterling slowly lowered his salute, but his eyes never left Ilara. He then turned his head, fixing Thorne with a gaze so cold, so filled with contempt, that the administrator physically recoiled. "This nurse!" Sterling's voice was no longer a rumble. It was a thunderous boom that echoed through the sudden, deathly quiet of the hallway, a voice accustomed to commanding armies. "Is Captain Ilara Vance, United States Army Special Operations Command, call sign Valkyrie. The woman you see before you is the sole survivor of Operation Nightfall, a mission so classified that the official report simply lists her entire team as lost in a training accident. For 72 hours, Captain Vance, already wounded, held a strategically critical position in Al-Qaim against a sustained assault by an entire enemy battalion after her team was ambushed and annihilated. She did this alone." He took a step closer to Thorne, who seemed to shrink under the weight of his words. "The scars you so callously mocked this morning," Sterling continued, his voice dripping with ice, "were earned while she repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to render aid to her dying comrades. The starburst pattern on her left arm is from the RPG shrapnel that tore through her body just before she single-handedly eliminated the enemy command post. She is a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 silver stars, and a purple heart with so many oak leaf clusters it looks like a branch. She refused to accept them publicly because she believes she failed her team. She believes she is the one who did not deserve to come home." The general turned his gaze to the assembled crowd of doctors and nurses who were now gathered at the end of the hall, their faces a canvas of shock, shame, and awe. This woman chose to leave that world behind, to dedicate her life to healing, to saving lives in a different way. She sought peace and anonymity. And you, he spun back to Thorne, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, you are the man who tried to fire a national hero for not smiling enough. You, in your infinite arrogance, created a hostile environment that nearly resulted in the assassination of a United States senator. Had she not been here, had she not been exactly who she is, we would be collecting Senator Thompson in a body bag. Thorne's face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Your professional life, Mr. Thorne, is over, Sterling stated, each word a nail in the coffin of Thorne's career. The board of directors has already been informed, but that is the least of your worries. It seems your hospital has some very creative accounting practices that are about to become of intense interest to the Internal Revenue Service, and your connections to certain offshore holding companies are about to be investigated by the Department of Justice under the RICO Act. We have your files. All of them. You should have been kinder. Thorne made a small, strangled sound and slid down the wall, collapsing into a heap on the floor. His ruin was absolute, swift, and public. A beat of stunned silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. Then one of the older surgeons, a man who had often been short-tempered with Ilara's quiet reserve, began to clap. It was a slow, hesitant sound at first. Then a nurse joined in, then another. Within seconds, the entire corridor was filled with a wave of thunderous applause. It was not the polite applause of a ceremony. It was a raw, emotional sound, a chorus of profound respect, of apology, and of unadulterated admiration for the quiet woman who had been a hero hiding in plain sight among them all. Ilara did not acknowledge the applause. She showed no sign of triumph, no hint of gloating. She simply met General Sterling's gaze and gave him a single, tired nod of understanding. Her war was over. Again. She methodically cleared the rifle, ejected the magazine, and laid the weapon on the floor, a symbolic act of relinquishing the violence she had been forced to embrace. She had finished stabilizing Agent Miller before Sterling's arrival, and now she watched as a team of medics carefully loaded him onto a gurney. Miller, though pale and weak, turned his head and looked at her, his eyes filled with a debt he knew he could never repay. "Valkyrie," Sterling said, his voice now gentle. "It's time to come home." He gestured to his team, and two of them moved to her side, not as guards, but as an honor escort. She turned her back on the hospital, on the life she had tried to build, and walked away. She walked with her back straight, her head held high, her scarred arms bare for all the world to see. She left the ruins of Marcus Thorne's career and the echoes of applause behind her, stepping out of the shadows and back into the world she had tried so desperately to escape, a quiet protector returning to her silent war. As she disappeared into the black suburban, the staff of St. Jude's was left to contemplate the profound truth of the day's events. They learned that heroes are not always loud, that they do not always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they wear scrubs and long sleeves. Sometimes the quietest people carry the heaviest burdens, their silence not a sign of weakness, but a shield forged to contain a fire the rest of the world could never comprehend. The scars a person hides are not always marks of shame or damage. Sometimes they are medals of honor, earned in battles no one ever saw, for a price no one else was willing to pay. And they learned in the most brutal and undeniable way to never again judge the quiet woman at the end of the hall.